Unknown to Mary Jane, she was already within a sniper's sights. Is target acquired? Negative. Only secondary target. I'm good to go if you want to. Hold off for now. Secondary target is viable as a consolation prize. The primary target remains. Peter? Holding out the phone, Aunt May told Mary Jane that Peter wanted to talk to her. Mary Jane was instantly relieved. Peter was already an hour late for dinner. She started by asking when he'd be home. They'd changed locations for safety since he revealed his secret identity to the world and even managed to clear out all the roaches. Peter interrupted her, and MJ immediately realized that something was wrong because Peter was using his serious voice. On a roof somewhere, Peter stammered before telling her that things were about to get very, very bad where he was. MJ was afraid that Peter was telling her goodbye, but he'd clarify that he wasn't saying anything was gonna happen to him. He just wanted to tell her that he loves her and that he'll see her again soon. Like the peak of a big-budget movie, this was it. The final battle of Earth's mightiest heroes against themselves. The end of the superhero civil war was playing out in the streets of New York. There was never any doubt that it would ever come to this sooner or later. As Captain America avoided Iron Man's repulsor blast while knocking into him with his shield, Spider-Man thought to himself how it didn't matter if a law was right or wrong, moral or immoral, an idea or a personal philosophy. No matter what, it always seemed like fights over ideas always make their way into the real world and become real violence. As Iron Man finally managed to shoot Cap, Spider-Man wondered why their dreams of peace and aspirations to love and better understand one another so commonly failed to do the same. Looking over, he didn't know. All he knew was that now that the final battle had begun, he wouldn't stop until Captain America stops. Which he didn't believe would ever happen, because Captain America wasn't the type to ever sacrifice what he stands for, not as long as he was still alive. He thought about the people in the media, the people in their overpriced condos and apartments, the press helicopters and Air Force jets with their weapons hot. He wondered if any of them realized that none of the heroes were really fighting for themselves, their territory, or even the right to wear a mask. They were all fighting for the people, for their ability to be there, no strings attached when the darkness comes. And as his loved ones watched on the television, he figured he'd never really know. In the end, all he cared about was the fact that Mary Jane and Aunt May understood, that they knew the truth, because without them, he wouldn't have anything worth fighting for. And as he took a hit to the face, he knew that he'd only have things worth dying for in that case. This superpowered battle was even seen from prison, as many of the criminals were happy to see the work of killing heroes done for them. Kingpin was seated on the stairs as his hitman told him that based on how the fight was going, it looked like they wouldn't need to pull the trigger at all. But Fisk disagreed. If Spider-Man survives, they'd take care of him when he gets home. If Spider-Man ends up dying in action, he wants his loved ones dead based on principle. They'd no doubt be devastated by the loss, which to him made their task an act of mercy. Just then, an inmate would call out to Kingpin, pointing at the screen. On it, the bloodshed was ended by Captain America, who, despite being on the verge of winning, realized that they weren't really fighting for the people anymore and decided to turn himself in, ordering all of his forces to stand down. The criminal guessed Kingpin never saw that one coming, but according to the crime lord, it was quite the opposite. He explained that at the end of every two-sided war, there could only ever be one winner and one loser. And this one in particular would be very useful to them. The news would speak of how the city of New York was still reeling and struggling to pick up the pieces of a destroyed neighborhood and come to terms with the events of the last day. The hitman listened in as they began to ask the question of what now? What did it all mean as we saw J. Jonah Jameson look at a board of possible headlines in front of him? Finally picking one, he'd tell them to run it. Slowly, people had begun to move out into the streets to assess the real extent of the damage and its cost. But with that, they wondered what sort of dollar amount could account for the lives lost, careers destroyed, relationships torn apart, and wounds that would never truly heal. Lost heroes, fallen heroes, and some who would never get up again. To make matters worse, there were heroes who couldn't be found in the rubble and destruction. Among them were Triathlon, Cold Blood, and New York's very own Spider-Man. Standing, Mary Jane said she needed to get some air, while Aunt May tried to assure her that Peter would be all right. He had to be. The hitman received an alert the moment she opened the door. Aiming his weapon, the man watched as she stepped out into the night. Looking up, she saw that the moon was full. To herself, she prayed that Peter was all right and safe. She was willing to give anything for him to just make it back home. She repeated herself as the hitman steadied his crosshairs over her face. The President of the United States was now meeting with his advisors to create the speech he'd give the nation that same night. At the same time, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives were saying that the conflict was now over and that the parties on all sides should come together in the best interest of the country, putting their differences behind them. Something that would be much harder for families like Giantsman's, who had to lay him to rest in a burial site the size of a parking lot. Kingpin would remind the shooter that Spider-Man has a knack for knowing when trouble was coming his way, so it was important that he remain as silent as possible until the right moment. But in time, the tired hitman drifted off to sleep. Aunt May warned against MJ waiting up all night for Peter like this, but just as she did, Peter arrived. Unlocking the door, MJ welcomed the love of her life as an alert simultaneously awoke the hitman up. He was ready. As they were observed from the window, MJ asked Peter how things went. He began telling her that everything was fine, but stopped when his spider sense began going off. Looking outside the window, he knew that something was wrong, and just as he did, the hitman pulled the trigger. Quickly knocking her out of harm's way, Peter asked her if she was alright before hearing the whimpers of his Aunt May. Turning with absolute dread on his face, the trauma of the day that defined Spider-Man's life had returned. No! Aunt May had been shot. Peter held Aunt May as she clung to his shirt, blood staining her own as Mary Jane covered her mouth in horror. But as he held her, Peter was enraged to see two more shots narrowly miss his beloved aunt. No more! He made a sprint for the door. No more! He busted through the door. No more! The hitman's eyes went wide with fear. Peter threw an entire truck in the shooter's direction. No more! The Jeep tore through the building and ultimately destroyed the weapon. MJ began to desperately dial 911, but as Peter rushed back into the home, he told her that they didn't have time for that. Aunt May would already be dead by the time paramedics arrived. Holding her as he leapt through the window, he again said that they had no time. Aunt May called out to her nephew as she faded in and out of consciousness. Peter told her to hang on, that he was getting her to a hospital and she'd be okay. She told him that he shouldn't, that if people see him, they'll know who he is. She began apologizing to him for making a mess of things, again saying how sorry she was before passing out again. As they neared the hospital, he cried out her name in utter sorrow. The hospital staff suddenly heard a large crash from upstairs. As they all rushed to see what was going on, one of the nurses called out for a trauma team immediately. As lying on an open bed with the window next to her broken was Aunt May. Recognizing her to be a gunshot victim, the hospital staff rallied to save her life. Affixed to the wall outside that very window as they spoke of how much blood she'd lost was Peter Parker. The next morning, comfortably seated in his somewhat furnished prison cell while doing some light reading, Kingpin was approached by a guard that had a message for him. He didn't know what it meant, but Fisk assured him that it was better that way. First gift basket was not delivered, but one of the other two baskets was delivered. Fisk closed his eyes before smiling, pleased that the evening wasn't a complete loss. Fisk asked the guard if he was familiar with Euripides. The guard asked which cell he was in, which Kingpin found to be amusing. Clearly, this guard wasn't exactly a scholar. Kingpin would clarify that Euripides was a Greek playwright that wrote several tragedies, the appreciation of which they had in common. And with that, he wrote what is probably the Kingpin's favorite line of all time. Whom the gods would destroy, they first drive mad. Fisk believed it prolonged the pleasure, intensifying it 1,000 times over. The guard didn't exactly understand, but Fisk would relieve him while sending his best regards to the man's wife. At the same time, MJ was in the city while Peter called to her from the shadows. Now secluded, she began to ask him how Aunt May was. He explained to her that they'd stabilized her condition, but she wasn't doing well. Covering his mouth, Peter admitted that he couldn't do anything for her, that everything was outside of his control. He insisted that it was all his fault. Then he told MJ which hospital she was in before mentioning that she'd need money. MJ still had the funds from when she cleaned out her accounts. It would be enough to cover her for a while, but without insurance, without telling anyone who she really was, they were on a time limit. They couldn't afford to have her real name listed because the people responsible would be able to find her and finish the job. Peter told MJ to book his aunt under her maiden name, May Riley. There might even be a birth certificate with that name somewhere. He needed MJ to go handle all the paperwork and ensure that things kept working. She agreed, but wondered where he'd be going. As he swung away, Peter told her that he's going to do what he does best when he really puts his mind to it. He's going to hurt someone. Peter returned to the scene of the crime. Walking into the apartment complex across the street with the Jeep hanging out of it, Peter, with a look of intensity, was told to stop by a cop with his hand on his hip. Peter just webbed the officer up without hesitation and left him there as he went up the stairs. Making his way to the room, Peter surveyed the scene. He was red hot with anger, but just then, his Spider-Man instincts led him in the right direction. Noticing something on the ground, he reached to pick it up. Looking at it, this was some sort of lens, one with an inscription on it. Realizing that he had what he needed, Peter skulked out the door, not bothering to free the cop from his webs. As he angrily swung through the night, Peter thought to himself that he couldn't do anything for Aunt May. He couldn't even show his face because it's all over every newspaper across town. He'd only be inviting more danger. He couldn't stand by her bed or hold her hands. He couldn't even tell her that he loves her. He had to leave it all to MJ and the doctors who he knew were doing everything they could. Meanwhile, this was all he could do. All he knew how to do. In New York, everyone knows where the untouchables hang out. Criminals so high up the food chain that even the police were scared to mess with them. High-level drug dealers who sell to congressmen and celebrities, the underground sex trade, and what he was after, gun runners. Peter didn't knock. As he broke through the side of the warehouse with his fist balled up, Peter wasn't in the mood at all. Springing into action, he knocked them all around as they fired endlessly. Tonight, he didn't care what the deal was, who these guys were, or why they were buying what they were buying. Leaping from point to point, Peter's only concern was the fact that they were getting between him and his target. But as he shot a web at the exit, he was sure that the man wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. Peter tore through them, as tonight, the rules were gone. No jokes, no punches pulled. As of tonight, no one gets away. No one threatens my family. No one. No one! Seeing that everyone had been laid out, Peter's target tripped over his words in fear. Raising his hands, he said that he didn't want any trouble, hoping to handle things peacefully. Peter grabbed him and told him to shut up. He then shoved the lens in the man's face, demanding that he tell him everything he knows about it. The man claims that he'd never seen it before. This prompted Peter to break the guy's hand like a piece of dry wood. As the criminal retched in pain, Peter knew that at another time, he might have taken comfort in the thought that this hand wouldn't be able to sell a gun or pull a trigger. But now wasn't the time for that. Not tonight. I didn't ask if you'd seen it before. I asked you to tell me what you know about it. The perp told him everything about the thing, including the fact that only a few dealers carry it. Peter demanded to know who, but the goon said that if he told, they'd kill him. What they do to you in a day or two, if they ever find it out, is a fraction of what I will do to you right now if the next word out of your mouth isn't a first name followed by a last name and an address. Repeat as necessary. Scared out of his mind, the man finally agreed. While this was happening, MJ was at the hospital dealing with a snarey receptionist before being allied over by the doctor that was treating Aunt May. She was in intensive care. They'd done everything they could to save her, but unfortunately, things weren't that simple. Now seeing her, the doctor explained that the woman was currently in a coma. They were keeping her alive thanks to all the machines, but her body hadn't picked up the slack. It was possible that, against all odds, she might somehow emerge from it fully functioning, but aside from that, sooner or later, she was going to die. She'll make it. She'll pull through, somehow. It's what she does. Peter swung across the night sky as lightning crackled. Now, I just have to do my part. Peter reached some gargoyles on the side of a building. I put this here a long time ago. I got rid of it in the first place because I thought it sent the wrong message. He looked at the webbed up item that hung below. Maybe I kept it because there might come a day when I'd want to send that message. That the rules don't apply anymore. That the gloves are off. He opened the concealed package. That I won't stop. Can't be stopped until I find the person responsible for shooting May. Peter brought the infamous cloth up to his face. I will find them. And when I do, I'm going to kill them. For another time Spider-Man stopped pulling his punches, check out our video on the time he killed Venom for hurting his wife and daughter.